My book on Eve Babbitt's, Hollywood's Eve, came out in 2019. Writing it was my way of driving a stake through her heart. It wasn't that I didn't love her, it was that I loved her too much. I'd been in her thrall for 9 years, ever since I bought a used copy of Slow Days Fast Company from a third-party seller on Amazon back in 2010. My appetite for details about her was gnawing, unappeasable. Her sister, her cousin, her old lovers and rivals and companions were now my friends. And when I wasn't on the phone with her, I was on the phone with them discussing her character and past, her motivations, both opaque and lucid, the various plot holes in which her narrative abounded. My preoccupation was unbalanced, fetishistic. Sick is what it was, and it made me sick, anxious and grasping, and in some obscure yet vital sense, self abandoned. I needed to stop living her life, reclaim my own. I needed to get violent. That's what was going on with Hollywood's Eve, which, by the way, started out a different book entirely, a book about LA from the mid 20th century to the early 21st. Eve, a key figure in it, though one among many. And then Eve took over. To be clear, I don't mean Eve the person, who was, by the time I knew her, an Eve made of shadow, there but not. I mean Eve the energy, Eve the spirit. Took over with my blessing. The idea was to give in to my obsession, submit to it, let it derange me, so that by the end, either it would be gone or I would. A kind of auto-exorcism. As plans go, a risky one. It worked, though. After publication, I no longer felt beset or crazed, was able to tend to my growing family. When I met Eve, I was pregnant with my first son. I'd have my second 2 years later. Pursue new interests and projects. An oral history of the writers of Bennington College, class of 1986, for Esquire. A podcast on former adult star Tracy Lords for a company called Cadence 13. To, in short, think about something, someone else. I was saved. It was on New Year's Day 2021 that Eve's sister Mirandy FaceTimed me. Mirandy and I usually spoke every week, but had skipped the last few, holiday madness, and our talk was happy, empty, what we said less important than the act of saying. We were 20 minutes into the call. She was telling me about Eve and Eve's move the month before to an assisted living facility in Westwood, the one Eve had resisted for years. Eve loves it, Mirandy said. Immediately, she amended this statement. Well, Eve doesn't hate it. I was only half listening. Archie, my younger boy, had entered the room and was tugging on my arm. He wanted to play. Realizing I was nodding, even though Mirandy hadn't said anything that required a nod, I forced my head to stop. I bugged my eyes at Archie, a warning, and said to Mirandy, what does she not hate about it? There's somebody to clean her room, for one thing, and cook. It's like living in a fancy hotel. Big surprise she's not bitching. I ignored the look Archie was giving me for bitching, then decided not to. Sorry, I mouthed. Mirandy laughed. Yeah, one she never has to check out of. Pulling Archie onto my lap, I changed my tone, made it serious. Is there anything she needs? I mean, that I can get her? Mirandy to Archie. Well, hello there, young man. To me. No, I think she has everything. Sure? Mirandy raised a finger. She told me to tell you to send P.G. Woodhouse. Did she say which books? No. I'll just send a bunch. Text me her address when we get off the phone. Mirandy said she would, then launched into a convoluted story about the difficulty of closing on Eve's apartment. Eve, it seemed, hadn't paid her mortgage for more than a year. Wells Fargo had sold the note to another company, which had in turn sold it to yet another company, and that company was now demanding Mirandy produce all manner of oddball documents. Plus, the escrow agent, a, quote, darling Jewish Persian, was all of a sudden acting less darling, and Mirandy suspected alcoholism. Archie was getting restless in my lap. I waited for Mirandy to pause, take a breath, so I could break in, let her know I had to go. Only she broke in first, interrupting herself to say, oh, I meant to tell you. I was cleaning out Evie's closets, mostly throwing things away, but at the back of one, underneath a whole load of crap, I found these boxes. Mother must have packed them when Eve left Wilton Place all the way back in. She stopped, her lips moving in silent calculation. 2001, I supplied automatically. That's right. Evie must have forgot about them or she never would have left them alone. Well, I opened one. Mirandy leaned into the screen confidentially. You're not going to believe what's in it. Letters. Lots of letters. To Eve, from Eve, and... Mirandy's words had just touched my consciousness, barely grazed it, when I felt my mouth go dry, a queasy flutter in the pit of my stomach. A voice inside my head whispered, "She's back." Archie began swinging his legs, a heel connecting painfully with my shin. I pushed him roughly off my lap. He whimpered, a distant buzz. "Everything all right, honey?" Mirandy said. I rubbed my eyes, the eyes that used to be mine, and nodded. "Sorry, yes. You were saying about the boxes?" Mirandy talked, but I couldn't hear a thing she said. Fear and dread were beating in my blood along with my heart, a wet, heavy pump, pump, pump. Those boxes. I kept waiting for Mirandy to ask me to fly to LA, go through them with her, but weeks passed and she didn't. And so, as Eve had shoved them to the back of her closet, I shoved them to the back of my mind. And that's where they stayed for almost a year. In that almost year, I got things done. I turned the oral history of the writers of Bennington College into a podcast, sold a proposal for a book on the same subject to Scribner, wrote various pieces for various magazines. I took my sons to school, my dog to the park, my husband for granted. Occasionally I cleaned, less occasionally I cooked. I was never not busy. And then, a few days before Christmas 2021, Eve, who'd been dying gradually, died suddenly. Her memorial was held in mid-January. The ceremony ended and Mirandy pulled me aside. Lowering her mask, COVID was still raging, she asked if I'd go with her to the Huntington Library while I was in town. The Huntington had acquired Eve's archives, the boxes included, the boxes principally. Unable to think of a polite way of saying no, I said yes. The next morning, I took an Uber to the Huntington, just outside Pasadena and San Marino. I arrived before Mirandy. This was intentional. I didn't know what kind of reaction I was going to have and wanted to have it in private. My driver dropped me at the wrought iron gates. I walked down a winding path through the grounds, spectacular though I scarcely noticed, to the research library. At reception, I slipped off my mask. The guard held up my ID to my face to make sure the two matched. Rubber gloves were given to me, along with the solemn instruction not to touch photographs or negatives barehanded. I was then led into a large, silent room full of tables. I sat at one in the back, playing with the fingers of the gloves and waiting for the man behind the desk to put down his newspaper, bring over the first box. Above my head, a wall clock softly ticked. I listened to it, listened to time, and tried to control my caroming thoughts. The boxes would turn out to be no big thing, I told myself. Mirandy was doubtless overvaluing their contents. Lots of letters probably meant a few faded postcards mixed with dry cleaning stubs, unpaid bills, junk mail flyers, and takeout menus from restaurants that had long since gone under. Eve, after all, was the slob of the world. Hadn't Mirandy found Ed Ruscha's Eve drawing, worth a couple $100,000 minimum, on the filth-covered floor of her bedroom, a giant footprint in the middle of it, for God's sake? Maybe I came here for nothing. Maybe she really was done with me. Maybe I'd be spared. At last, the man slid the box onto the tabletop. I smiled my thanks. He didn't smile back, and several seconds passed before I understood why. He couldn't see my smile. It was behind my mask. The man returned to his desk. I waited for him to reopen his newspaper, a screen between us, then reach for the box. With a trembling hand, I lifted the lid. The first item I pulled out, a letter. It was a page and a half long, typewritten, with handwritten corrections. From Eve to, quote, Dear Joan. Dear Joan. I stared at those two words, uncomprehended, incomprehensible, until it dawned on me what they meant. Dear Joan was that Joan, the Joan, Joan Didion. Excitement rose in my throat like bile. Phrases began leaping out at me. Burning babies, foggy brains, ill-bred, drooling, uninvited art. I squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened them, I dragged them to the first line and started to read, making myself go slow. Dear Joan, this morning I telephoned and wanted you to read A Room of One's Own because it struck me because I was thinking about what you said about Quintana and the sprinklers, and I was again remembering this shimmer of accuracy that Virginia Woolf got in The Waves, which you say you haven't read. It's so hard to get certain things together, and especially you and VW, because you're mad at her about the diaries. It's entirely about you that you can't stand her diaries. It goes with Sacramento. Maybe it's better that you stay with Sacramento and hate diaries and ignore the fact that every morning when you eye the breakfast table uneasily, waiting to get away, back to your typewriter, maybe it's easier that you examine your life in every way except the main one, which Sacramento would brush aside, but which Virginia Woolf kept babbling on about. Maybe it's about you and Sacramento that you feel it's undignified, not cricket, and bad form to let art be one of the variables. Art, my God, Joan, I'm embarrassed to mention it in front of you, you know, but you mentioned burning babies in locked cars, so I can mention art. You said that the only thing you like to do was write. Just think if it were 200 years ago and the only thing you like to do was write. I know I'm not making sense, but the thing beyond which your article on the women's movement was about was what A Room of One's Own is about. The whole woman's thing that is going on now is so stark and obscene most of the time that no wonder one recoils in horror. But for a long, long, long time, women didn't have any money and didn't have any time and were considered unfeminine if they shone like you do, Joan. Just think, Joan, if you were 5'11" and wrote like you do and stuff, people would judge you differently and your work. They'd invent reasons. Could you write what you write if you weren't so tiny, Joan? Would you be allowed to if you weren't physically so unthreatening? Would the balance of power between you and John have collapsed long ago if it weren't that he regards you a lot of the time as a child, so it's all right that you are famous? And you yourself keep making it more all right because you are always referring to your size. And so what you do, Joan, is live in the pioneer days, a brave survivor of the Donner Pass, putting up the preserves and down the women's movement, and acting as though art wasn't in the house and wishing you could go right. It embarrasses me that you don't read Virginia Woolf. I feel as though you think she's a woman's novelist, and that only foggy brains could like her, and that you, sharp, accurate journalist, you would never join the ranks of people who sobbed around in the waves. You prefer to be with the boys, snickering at the silly women, and writing accurate prose about Mariah, who had everything but art. Vulgar, ill-bred, drooling, uninvited art. It's the only thing that's real other than murder, I sometimes think, or death. Art's the fun part, at least for me. It's the salvation. When I reached the last line, I took a deep breath, only to find I couldn't. My breath refused to catch, turn over. All I could do was breathe, rapidly, shallowly. All I could do was breathe, rapidly, shallowly, skimming off the top of my lungs. A lover's quarrel. That's what this letter was. The tone that alternated between je accuse and groveling, the recriminations and resentments hurled like thunderbolts, the flashes of rage, despair, impatience, contempt. Eve was talking to Joan the way you talk to someone who's burrowed deep under your skin, whose skin you're trying to burrow deep under.
Hello, and welcome to the SKYLIT Books podcast. My name is Elodie, and I'm delighted to have Lili Anolik here to discuss her latest book, DIDION and BABITZ. In 2019, Lili published Hollywood's Eve, the first biography on legendary writer and artist Eve Babitz. DIDION and BABITZ is her riveting follow-up, a fascinating exploration into the complicated relationship between Eve and another great American writer hailing from California, the ever so elusive Joan Didion. BABITZ and DIDION both chronicled Los Angeles in the late 60s and 70s. The two, however, couldn't have been more different. DIDION, the picture of a cool customer, shrewd and ruthless. Eve, the ultimate romantic, exuberant and sometimes dangerously hedonistic. DIDION became an established literary figure early on in her career, while BABITZ struggled for decades, eventually falling into obscurity into the late 2010s. If you're an admirer of BABITZ and DIDION, or fascinated by the cult of personality surrounding both, DIDION and BABITZ is an essential read. Through in-depth interviews and never-before-seen letters, Anolik unearths the relationships, conflicts, and scenes that shaped these formidable writers. Lili Anolik is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and a writer at large for Airmail. Her work has appeared in Harper's, Esquire, and the Paris Review. Thank you so much for being here, Lili.
My pleasure.
I wanted to start with the preface because
Sure.
it, to me, and the letter with Joan, because to me it gets at the heart of this book and what you're trying to do with this book. And
Sure.
as you describe, so it's almost cinematic, right? I feel like we're being
Yeah.
taken on this wonderful journey of these letters and what you discover through them. So yeah, I would just love for you to take me back to that moment. And what was it that struck you about these letters? What shocked you? What brought you back to that obsession with Eve in that moment?
Yeah, well, it's like funny because it was an ambivalent moment for me, because the first item I pulled out of the box was that letter. Just by crazy happenstance, I pulled out the letter Eve wrote to Joan in 1972. And it was just this electric document, right? I knew Eve really well. I spent, I mean, hundreds of hours talking to her in those kind of last 10 years of her life. Her brain was crumbling because she had Huntington's disease. But she was candid with me. I mean, if you asked her a question, she would answer it. But Evie had a code. Um, um, she was she was charming. I mean, and I mean this in a really deep way. Like she wouldn't allow herself. She wouldn't complain. I think that was against her style, right? And so she would not really tell me about the difficulties she had or faced or felt. And I knew she had a relationship with Joan because I knew Joan had got her published. Joan helped her get into Rolling Stone in 1972, a piece she wrote on Hollywood High called The Chic. So I knew that. And I knew they'd been part of this kind of scene in the late 60s and early 70s that sort of centered around Joan's house in Hollywood on Franklin Avenue. And this kind of, it was kind of this scene of artists and rock and rollers and kind of flamboyant lowlifes. So I knew all that, but I had no idea about the perilous intimacy between Joan and Eve, that that Joan edited Eve's first book, Eve's Hollywood. You really do have to be a writer to understand what a commitment that is. It's a big deal to edit somebody's book. And Joan did not really do that for other young writers. I mean, I couldn't find any. So the connection between them was deep, and it was. I think Eve loved her and Eve hated her, right? It was a strong thing, right? So in that letter, Eve is taking Joan to task for a piece Joan wrote for the New York Times on the women's movement, and I've always actually loved this piece of Joan's. It's very kind of cool bitch stylish, and she's sort of making fun of feminists. And Eve also had a problem with feminists, just their style, but she knew that they had a point. They were making an important point, and Joan completely rejected that point. Joan says something like, women aren't forced to buy the package, um, kind of saying that sexism was in women's heads, which in 1972 it absolutely was not. And I think Eve felt that Joan, to get in to get into the boys club, right? To be a big American writer, and they only let men into that club. She felt that Joan pandered to men and sold out women. And that's essentially what she's accusing her of in that piece. And it's a strong accusation. And just that she would talk to her in this way, or that she felt this kind of this impassioned, was so exciting to me. And the two women became alive to me in a way that they probably hadn't been before, because these letters, they're the living, breathing, they're written in the living, breathing present, right? It's not on reflection. It's not, there's something so immediate. You can feel like the sweat, the heat, the tears, right, all coming off these documents, right? So this is a very long answer to your question, but it put me kind of right in the middle of a fight in a way, that was ongoing. And that was just the moment I knew I was under contract to write another book. I had moved on to other subjects, and I knew I was back in, right? That the book I had written on Eve, I had done the absolute best I could on it, but it was incomplete, and that I was going to have to go back.
And I mean, it's so incredible what we learn about both of them, and particularly what it took for them to become the writers and the women that have become icons now.
Yes,
And I think this is also such a fascinating book about writing, right? And the
yes,
relationship between writing and persona and what it takes to create a career as a writer. And I think the
yes. What
yeah
it takes, the high
yeah
price you pay.
yes, and it's blood, sweat, and tears, like you're saying. And I think the flip side to this letter, or the, like, if this is the A side, the B side, I think, is that letter she writes to the writer Joseph Heller, where
Yes,
she's embodying what Joan, like, she's embodying this idea that people refuse to take her seriously
yeah,
because of the way that she lives her life and embodies what is in
yeah,
fact her art. And you can feel that there's so much like rage and anger and power. Like, it feels like a manifesto, but again,
it
right, like,
is.
she didn't identify with the feminist movement, but again, she, so many ways, I think, embodied, right,
Yeah.
like what it was about. And yeah, it's just fascinating to think about how
I
we're
think of those two letters as bookends. I think you're completely right. Or a pair, not bookends, but a pair. I think that's
right,
totally right. They were the
right.
two most exciting letters to me.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear that you said that in your interactions with Eve, you felt like it was difficult for you to get from her what was difficult, what was challenging. Like, she was so charming, but in these letters, like, I really felt for her. I felt
Yeah.
like she was on, like, it was uncharted territory what she was
Yes.
doing. Like, there was no model for who she was, and she wasn't going to be a Joan. And Joan was literally like the only model for a great American female writer, like someone who is mythologized even before they're dead.
Yep. No,
Um,
no, there's no, and was so good at self-mythologizing. But I think I always felt what was so telling was who there was a model in a way for Eve. It's just it was not a successful model in a sense. Like Joan picks as her model Hemingway. She picks a man. And I would say that what she learned from Hemingway, I mean, I think to me, nobody ran a career better than Joan, with the possible exception of Hemingway, right? To me, somehow they embody, they are their, somehow there's a conflation between them, their lives, their characters, their era. They embody it all. And that takes, like, you have to be so shrewd, so canny, and you have to get lucky too. But Joan did all of that. And I think like what Joan is not to my taste. For whatever reason, temperamentally, we just are not suited to one another. But, and I know this book probably is hard for people who are diehard about Joan, except I admire her so much in a way, like nobody, it's it isn't some way I see my book as a how-to guide, right? How to run a career as a female. Nobody was smarter about it. But she paid such a high price, right? Like I thought her personal life, when you find out what went on in her personal life, um, she's what she and Eve had in common, I think, was that to be an artist or to be a writer was the most important thing to them, and they were straight down the line. Now, Joan played a different game. I think she was very kind of complicit in the sentimentalizing of her story, right? Like she was a mother and she was a wife, but you know, I really feel that marriage was an extension of her career. I don't mean that there wasn't emotion between her and John, but I think the man she had been in love with was Noel Parmentel. That doesn't work out. Noel won't marry her. This is in the 50s, early 60s. And then he picks somebody for her to marry. That's a wild thing to me. Finding that out was insane to me, right? He picked a hanger on, like he picked like one of his little sidekicks, right? And I remember he sat across from me. We were sitting on his porch and he said to me, I would edit Joan, but I wouldn't edit every line. John would edit every line. So it's like she was the superior writer to John, there's no question, but he was a great editor and she had that in house. And I feel like I don't think he was straight. I think it was a difficult, he had an insane temper. He was really a heavy drinker. I mean, it was a very volatile marriage for a period, but I think that she kind of put up with it in a sense because he was an incredibly shrewd manager of her career and his own career. They were really good about that. And he would edit everything. So he made her a better writer. And I feel like that's what she chose. And that's, you know what? That's great. It couldn't have gone better for her in a way. She became the most famous writer we have. But I just wanted people to understand the price she paid, to achieve this kind of greatness. Now, Eve went the other way, right? I just felt like the torture of being Eve, on the other hand, who kind of very much was what she was, and paid the price, right? Like just even as like a woman who's born in 1978, who's coming along many decades later, some of the choices Eve would make would be like torturous for me. The way she would describe herself to other people as a groupie, right? The way she fucked around so much. It's like, that's great. I mean, like in ways I totally admire it, but I'm like, oh, if you want to get taken seriously, people aren't that smart and people are literal minded and there's a weird kind of sexism that they don't even realize is sexism, but they put women into categories. And I can tell you, I know this firsthand because when I started on Eve, it was all the way back in 2012, right? And there had been no resurgence. And Eve, I even feel weird calling it a resurgence because really the moment passed her by when she was actually writing, she really never popped. She published and she was in Knopf, which is great, but she never was a big deal in her time, right? Like it just didn't happen for her. And I know it didn't happen for her because so when I'm interviewing these people in 2010 and 2012 and she's not a thing again, half the people I interviewed who were her contemporaries were like, why are you writing about this bimbo? What are you doing? Really, like they talk about her as a groupie, the tits, the fucking around. Now it's a completely different thing. Now she's like in the canon. But like when I started on this, like when I was, for the Vanity Fair piece, it was half the people could not believe I was bothering. Do you know?
Yeah. I mean, and there's that Julian Wasser quote that is just so telling where, you talk about interviewing him and you talk about Joan or, the photo. Yeah, I mean, those photographs too are just, they encapsulate like the two different responses that they received.
It's
And
Eve has no face.
yeah,
She's a naked body and Joan's
yeah.
all head.
And Joan is powerful. And when you're talking to him, he says, you don't tell a girl like Joan what to do, where to pose. And then, when you bring up what Eve, he says, oh, why did you take, you ask, why did you take this photograph of her? He's like, because she was a piece of ass. Like,
Because she was a
just,
piece of that.
yeah. And that just tells you everything about how
The attitudes.
yeah. And
And he
it's,
was my first interview. And the thing is, Julian's great. I mean, Julian, you can see, you can't, like in my apartment, see, or my office, you can see I have like one of the outtakes.
oh,
That's a Julian Wasser.
wow.
I think he's like a great photographer, but that was his attitude. He was the first person I interviewed for this. I remember meeting him at Mel's Diner. And his attitude, I'm telling you, that was half the people I interviewed's attitude about her. What are you thinking? She was just a bimbo, who had like a typewriter. So yes, so it's like but the thing is, Joan really, I always felt like what was also fascinating is I really felt Joan tried to protect Eve from this. And Joan knew, I never know how to say this word, imprimatur, if she had, Joan tried to give like Eve the protection of her reputation. If had Eve fires Joan from the job of editing Eve's Hollywood. Had Joan edited that book and publicly come out in support of it, she would have had a totally different reception. But basically, Eve couldn't do it, right? Like I think she felt like Joan wanted her to behave like a professional. Like it was like to Eve, professionalism was the antithesis of art, right? That's why she hated Hollywood, anything 9 to 5. Eve worked obsessively, but she worked in her own crazy ass way, like getting up at 4 in the morning, high on speed or whatever Ritalin she was taking, meaning like she just she couldn't bear professionalism. It was her enemy. And so she fires Joan off of that book, and you know, and in ways that kind of completely that sets the tone for her career, and it's never really going to work for her while she's actually writing and having a career. And then
And
there's the fact, I mean, I should also say, Joan was a craftsman versus Eve, who's improvisatory, right? They're the two opposites. They work in opposite ways. Now, in my opinion, Eve wrote one masterpiece. It was Slow Days, Fast Company, and there was a kind of a mixed response to it. But had she stayed on that path, I think things would have worked for her. I do think people would have caught on, but instead she loses confidence. Her drug problem gets out of control. She's with the wrong guy. She's quarreling with her editors. You can see it all in that Joseph Heller letter where she said, "I'm going to write a novel. I'm going to stop writing spurts," right? Which was really the form she had invented for herself. You can see her go off the rails. And also, she just wasn't built to last a long time. I mean, she lived in too chaotic a way. So it's great it worked once. I mean, first of all, there's great stuff in Eve's Hollywood. And then to me, Slow Days is a masterpiece. So we're lucky we got that out of her, you know? But like Joan has books that miss, but they're always at a high level. Like the prose is at a high level. It's got a structure. It's disciplined. Um, Sorry, that was way too long an answer. I'm so sorry.
no,
Please.
no. I mean, yeah, I do remember reading. I mean, I read Slow Days, Fast Company first. And when I tell you, I fell in love with the voice behind that book. Like
Yes.
reading that book is so pleasurable. Like I wish I could read it for
Yeah.
the first time again. And
That
you,
good.
yeah, you just fall in love with this person. But
And she had on that, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but she also, I should say Vicki Wilson too, her editor. She had the exact right editor on that book.
mm,
Nobody really edited Eve's Hollywood, and you can see the book's just so uneven. There are great pieces, there are not so great pieces. It takes a while to get going. There was no real editorial hand. Vicki sequenced the pieces, she tossed out a bunch, and she came up with that thing where Eve, kind of the linking device is at the beginning of each of the little stories, she writes a note to Paul Roche. It's like a seduction of him. And that was Vicky. So it's like she had everything came together with her in that book. But I'm so sorry. Please keep going. I just had to insert that.
no, no, absolutely. And I think that's why this book is so important for people who are fascinated by both of them, or
Yeah.
especially like I feel one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about this or was so interested in this is the resurgence, or it's not resurgence
Yeah.
isn't the right
But yeah.
word, but is the mythologizing that has happened for both of these women and especially
Yes.
Eve. And I think it's so important that you're revealing what it took, and that it's messy and it's complicated, and that there
And
was so
painful
and painful
and
and
lonely and
yeah,
hard for
yeah.
both of them. I felt for both of them.
Mm,
One was married and this, that, but I still felt it was a lonely, hard road. I'd also like to just say too, I think I say this in the book, but it's something I feel like I think the reason Eve caught on because the world was ready for her, you know, at a certain point, the world was ready for her. But I always felt like it sounds like a brag. I don't mean it that way. Um, but I think that Vanity Fair piece was her books could have gotten reissued and they would have caught on because Slow Days is so good. But I feel like she's really become kind of a cultural icon, if you know what I mean. Like it's her, it's Eve qua Eve. It's not just the books, it's who she represents as a cultural figure. And I feel like when she was writing, she wouldn't create a persona for herself. Joan was so smart about how she created this persona for herself. It's how she was photographed, it's how she talked about herself, everything. She was so shrewd about this. And Eve, who had this completely fascinating, glamorous, dramatic life, did not do that. Right. And I just felt like that Vanity Fair piece because I still had her and she could still talk and she's like a great interview. But it was also just putting together this wild, chaotic life, right? It was the naked photo with Duchamp. It was the MASH letter to Joseph Heller. It was the unbelievable sex resume. It was the album covers, all of it. It was the crash and burn of her. And then it was the fire. Do you know what I mean? So it's like this exciting story. And I think that's part of it.
yes, absolutely. Yes, it's almost like the story of her life itself supersedes what she
Yeah.
created.
Yeah, or it's all part of like it's the same with Joan. Like there's something about what I was saying about Hemingway, it's true of Fitzgerald too, where it's the work, it's the characters, it's the wild life that seems to be part of the work in a way. Like they seem to embody their characters in their time. That's like that's the trick, I think, to becoming an icon in those ways. Like you have to have all those elements in place.
Mm, that's really interesting. And do you think that's what it takes to become an American icon, right? Like to
Yeah.
become, a
Yeah.
literary, because, compared to Europe, our relationship to the arts, to writing, to the tradition of writing is so
Yeah.
different. And it feels like such an American thing to me, right? Like you have to become, like, honestly, something that you can sort of sell, or a brand, or something that can be
No question.
distilled,
No question. There's no question that's true. And I had done this long thing. The big project I had done before this was on Bennington College, class of 1986. It was in between the two books, in between Hollywood's Eve and Didion and Babbitt's. It started as an Esquire piece, and it was on the writers of Bennington class of 86, Bret Easton Ellis, Jonathan Lethem, Donna Tartt. But I would see it with Bret and Donna. Like their iconographic, like their persona is as thrilling to people as their work. And it's somehow like I feel like you need that in America. And I don't know why. Probably because of our fucked up relationship with the arts. I don't even know. But you need it. You somehow need it, like to stick around.
Mm, yeah, it's fascinating. And I even think, like, even after death, like Didion's auction and the fervor over that, like even in death, like people are still obsessed, still want like a piece of
A
her, piece
piece.
of, yeah, which is really fascinating. And do you think Joan herself knew from the beginning that she had to become this person, or do you think it was Noel? Do you think it was like that moment of making that alliance with John Donne? Like, what do you think?
It was more emotional than that. Like I bet it was more instinctive.
Mm,
But at a certain point when the marriage is really in terrible shape, really like when John's living in Las Vegas for a year and doing God knows what, I think she'd had that run, like slouching toward Bethlehem comes out in 68 and then Play It As It Lays. And all of a sudden she's at this, that comes out in 70. And I'm sure she just, and the book she had done and dedicated to Noel, and Noel got published for her was Run River, her first novel, which came out, I want to say 64, right around there. And it sank without a trace. It just sank without a trace. Now Noel had gotten her in magazines, he got the book published, which helps. But I think she felt it was working with John. I mean, and she kept writing about Noel. I mean, Noel is the muse, right? Like Noel is he's Ryder Channing in Run River, then he's Ivan Costello in Play It As It Lays. He's the guy in Goodbye to All That and Slouching Toward Bethlehem. Then she's going to write a whole book on him and a book of Common Prayer before they have their falling out in the late 70s. So I think she extracted from Noel all she could. But yeah, like in a professional sense, it was an incredibly successful union. And it's like, it's not like I think Joan was cynical. I think it was also she's just reading the room. Like if you wanted to get in the club, you had they were going to let one woman in, and she makes herself so small and so tiny, so physically unintimidating. That's what Eve is yelling at her about. Eve, who had large breasts and was just so undeniably female. I mean, Joan was just a canny operator, and I think I don't even give her. I'm not giving her shit for this. It was so hard. It was so hard to do what she did, and it kind of worked for both of them. It just for Eve, she just didn't have the success when she was young, but it came. It worked. It worked for both of them.
absolutely. And
You know.
yeah, yeah. Where when you read this letter and you dove back in and thought about writing about the both of them, were you worried about the criticism of, oh, you're just pitting these two women together, you know?
Sure, you gird your loins. I mean, whatever. Yeah. I mean, like, I feel like I'm like 46 and I've just been around the block, and people are always going to give you a hard time. So, yeah, it's no problem. I mean, the truth of the matter was, it's like, I wrote this book against my will. I mean, I really did not intend to write this book or want to write this book. And then originally, I just thought I would revise the way I thought of this in my brain. And it might have been me tricking myself because I just know what it takes to write a book. But I really just thought I was going to revise the Eve book, and that what I would do, I wrote a long piece for Vanity Fair on the letter Eve wrote Joan. It was like a 7,000, 8,000 word piece, and I was going to have that as the introduction, and then I was just going to insert letters throughout, because I knew I got things wrong, and I was going to try to rectify that. But then I just start to do it, and I just, these things have a life of their own. And then at a certain point, I realized I'm writing a shadow book on Joan Didion too. that Joan, who's so opaque, I feel like if anything is my beat, it's literary Los Angeles, and Joan is the towering figure, right? You cannot get around her. She is so big, she blots out the sun. I write a lot about Bret Easton Ellis or Pauline Kael. You cannot avoid Joan. And I just felt like I've been at this for so long, a dozen years, and I felt like I was standing outside a locked door with Joan because she writes confessionally on the surface. She is her own subject, but she is so opaque. She is so hidden. She is so guarded. She only tells you what she wants you to know. And then I felt when I was getting into these letters of Eve's, I should also add, this is extremely important. The letters that Eve wrote that are in these blocks are letters she did not send, right? These are letters, they're a very particular genre. Janet Malcolm writes about this, the unsent letter. It's a letter that you think is so important, basically, you cannot entrust it to the recipient. You are basically saving it for somebody like a posterity type person, such as myself, right? You're entrusting it to somebody, a future reader who's going to understand the letter. You don't believe that the person you're sending it to will, that it's too revealing. Like that letter she wrote to Joseph Heller. She never sent any of these letters. So they essentially form a diary. At any rate, like they were the key that opened Eve for me, but they were the key that opened Joan too. And I'd also just say, like, you're moving, I'm a human being who's living in time and space. And when I started approaching Eve, I was a barely published writer. Um, and now I'm older and I know a lot, I know way more people, including like knowing Griffin Dunn pretty well. Like finding Noel, like you all of a sudden your access levels change and you can get so much closer to it, right? So it was that too. And I'd also had these relationships with like Lori Pepper, Eve's cousin, Mirandy, Dan Wakefield, who'd been Eve's lover, one of Joan's closest friends, you getting in deeper and deeper with people and you know more and more. Do you know, like these things take so long. Like you can't, like the book technically I wrote in 2.5 years, but not really. It's really a 12, 13-year process. Sorry, I knocked myself off my own point, but I wanted to
No,
make sure, you knew that about the letters. I know you knew, but the general public.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for reminding us of that and also sharing that because it reveals the work that you yourself have done and put in as a writer and it's there's some real tea in this book, I will say. and but
Yeah, for
you
sure,
yeah, but you put in that work, you put in that time, you knew Eve and you're part of the reason why I'm here talking to you and I can have this connection to these writers and this scene. So I think,
It's exciting.
yeah, it's really beautiful, and I hope that know that it's like your work has
So
had
nice.
a true
That's like
impact.
such a lovely thing to say. Yeah, no, no, it was a thrill and a privilege.
I'm curious how working on this book, or after all this time meeting these people, diving deep into the scene, how your relationship to both Eve and Joan has changed. And
I feel like I know the book will be upsetting to certain Didion people, though I really don't think it should be. I feel very close to both of them. Like it's a funny thing. Like I actually, this is gonna sound crazy coming from me, but like I don't like to see Joan criticized. It's a weird, a weird thing. Like I feel like anytime I take on like a serious project, like whether it's a podcast. I mean, like I essentially think of podcasts also as books that talk. There are 12 episodes. They're hugely long when I do them. And I feel like I would only ever approach like anything I'm going to do something long, like a book or a podcast on, I only would do it if I loved, if I felt serious passion about the person. And I feel like love excuses a lot, meaning I think that Joan is great. And I think that Eve is great. And I think they're both important. And I also, my own feeling too is like, I, I, I love them, but it's a clear-eyed love. Like, I feel like fan talk or worship doesn't get anybody anywhere, and you don't understand anything if that's how you look at things. I mean, there's also just real people underneath this that are performing these magic acts, right? Writing these great books. And I think it's good to know how they did it. I just think it's good to know how they did it. It's like there was a funny reaction. I mentioned that piece I had done for Vanity Fair, not the first Eve profile in 2014, but the piece on the letter Eve wrote Joan. And Courtney Love, of all people, started to comment on, I had posted it to Instagram, and I think she was DMing me. I can't tell how she was doing this something on Instagram. I don't know if she was posting it on my page or DMing me, but she was saying that the letter, the pull quote on the Vanity Fair piece was, could you write what you write, Joan, if you weren't so tiny? And Courtney starts to riff off of this, and she says that she and Madonna used to exchange poison pen letters back in the day. And yeah, and she said, Courtney said something very funny, like, I had other short friends, but somehow Madonna's shortness enraged me. It's such a funny line, but those two were also kind of like both kind of fascinated and repelled by each other. And, one is kind of the Joan, like Madonna's the Joan, right? Controlled, eye on the prize, trim, just, very, very careerist and clever in those ways. And then you had a Courtney who's like an Eve, and it's, you know, kind of a walk on the wild side and emotionally sloppy, but kind of morally courageous in this very particular way. And I just feel like it's that those two figures, everybody is kind of one or the other, and you always have, do you know what I mean? And you always have the Joan in your life or the Eve in your life, like, and that you're both repelled by and totally into, right?
Absolutely. It feels so like Freudian or so deep. Like it speaks to what it is to be a woman and
Yes.
yeah, what it is in
Yes.
the
And the
dueling.
choices you make to be one or
Yes.
the other, because it's a choice at
Yes.
some level, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I for one, I personally I identify with, I feel more like an Eve in
I
some
knew you
ways.
would say.
But also there is a part of me that has, because I am a writer and I identify as an ambitious person,
Yep.
that respects Joe so much,
How
that
can you not?
she hustled, she did the work. Like there's
Always.
no denying she woke up at 8 and like finished at 4 p.m. and
Every
she
day.
only had the Coke and like that was
Yeah,
it.
and
And
like two almonds.
yeah, which infuriates me, but also like there's a part of me that is like, that discipline is so admirable. So yeah, I think it's maybe what we all as women, like I'm saying, have to wrestle with in ourselves, or how we see other women in our lives, or
Yeah,
successful women, or and how complicated and messy it is. And I love that about this book. I love that you're not shying away from that, because I think
no
a
way.
really reductive interpretation of it would be that, oh, Lily's
It's
just,
pro Eve, anti Joan.
yes,
Yeah, but it's
exactly.
not. Yeah,
It's
no, for sure.
so not.
And also what you say, there's another part of this too. It's like like off of what you're saying. In some ways, like romantic love, the thing is, Eve in her life slept with both men and women, but I would really consider her heterosexual because she was so boy crazy, and women didn't really make it into her letters. Like only Annie Leibovitz, like, meaning, I don't know what I'm trying to say is, I guess, like, I feel like the relationship we talk about kind of most is kind of a heterosexual, like or even a romantic, not even heterosexual, like romantic relationships, like who you pair off with romantically, and that kind of being the most important relationship in your life, apart from, with parent child, or, those really, but like the relationships you choose, meaning not your parents and not your children. A romantic relationship is kind of given primacy. But in some ways, I feel like these women, and listen, I know I would always be careful when I talk to Didion people. I know that, Eve was someone Joan probably dismissed after 1979. She looked at Eve as kind of a missed opportunity, Eve as kind of a person who got spit up, chewed up and spit out by the decade, like a casualty of that time and place. And she's not entirely wrong, because I think Eve's best work is from that time and place. But I think at a certain point, Joan was very preoccupied with Eve, right? And I also think Joan was competitive in a very straightforward way, where I'm sure she just left Eve in the dust at a certain point, right? Like Eve just, right. But I think at a certain time, and when both were doing their best work, because to me, Joan was at her best in Slouching and White Album, which is absolutely that Franklin Avenue period. It's absolutely coming out of that scene, and Eve's a key person. And Eve's I think every time Joan writes about herself and is describing an ideal version of herself, which bears no resemblance to her, she's always describing Eve. So there's that. Anyway, where I'm going with this is that sometimes those funny kind of those relationships that you almost can't call, if you have to trap it in language, you would call it a friendship, but it's a more complicated and more emotionally volatile relationship than that. And it's often between people of the same sex. And it's not romantic, but it's kind of obsessive in the way of romantic love. And we don't really have a word for what that is. I'm saying friendship is inadequate, right? But they had that. And I think you see it like if you read the Ferrante, My Brilliant Friend, again, kind of between two heterosexual women, but they're the most important one in the other's lives, and they love each other and they hate each other and they imitate each other and they fight with each other. It's all that stuff, and I do feel like you see that in the Eve and Joan thing. It is a thing. It's a relationship that is hugely, hugely important that does not have a word assigned to it and that does not really get talked about. But this is that incarnate, you know?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. It's like the a person who can't help but get under your skin. Like
Yeah.
you're undone by them. They're getting at you, and you really feel that with the like this weird mirroring that occurs.
Yes. And there's something about their presence that you both want to be that person and you don't want to be any, like there's a reproach in that person. Like that person is a reproach to you. Like I'm sure you looked at Joan and thought, Jesus Christ, why can't I get my fucking act together? And why can't I get my career on the road? And why do I get dismissed in every review? And I'm sure Joan looked at Eve, when Joan writes that great piece on self-respect and she quotes Rhett Butler saying, with enough courage, a person can do without a reputation. Joan quotes that very approvingly and knows that it's true, but she is not someone who ever for a second did not obsessively care for, cultivate, consolidate, enhance her reputation. But she knows in some kind of weird moral sense that that's a higher person, like the person who does do without a reputation. But that person's kind of, anyway, I'm repeating myself, but it's a real thing between them.
Yeah, and just to close and just thinking about this book being in the world, which I'm so excited for. What do you hope people take away or gain?
Everything we talked about.
Yeah.
I don't know everything. I mean, to me they contain everything about the American literary world. They contain everything about women and women, men and women, how to have a career, the walk on the wild side versus the control freak, craftsman's versus improvisation. It's everything. Plus, it's post-Manson Los Angeles. But I think those two contain multitudes, right? So that's it.
Absolutely.
Everything in the universe, Elodie. That is what I'm hoping they take.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Lili, for being here and chatting. I think our readers and the people who love the store can't wait to get their hands on this book. And
my pleasure. It's really fun, Elodie. This is great.
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time.
A pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode or others, please visit skylitbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.